work session, June 30th. The subject today is the Charter Commission. Thank you all for being here. Before we launch in today's briefing, I'd like to just first acknowledge that Portland's original charter was written with the explicit intent to continue the legacy of settler colonialism in Oregon Territory and to eliminate the presence of the Indigenous people who once thrived here. I believe it's our duty to include the examination of this history and how it continues to impact tribal nations in the region and the urban American Indian and Alaska Native community that's here today. We look forward to inviting representation from the urban Native community to be a part of this commission. And it's my hope that the inclusion of Native voices on this commission will help forge a new legacy for Portland moving forward. I think it's safe to say that nobody could have predicted the events of this year. 6 months into 2020, we've been faced with a global pandemic, a global recession, and an international uprising in the response to anti-Black racism. The resilience of this city is obviously being tested. And over the past few months, we've learned that many things we thought about how our city operates aren't quite true. We've told ourselves that transitioning to teleworking would take years, but we were up and running in a few weeks. We told ourselves that public safety reform could only be incremental, and it would only be incremental, but this city council just voted for major changes that will change how this city approaches community safety. We've told ourselves that being flexible and agile are things that are hard for cities. Well, we just watched the city budget office draft 3 different budgets in just the last 3 months. And I think we can all agree we don't want to do that last one again. What's been driven home to all of us on the city council is that the time to do what is right for Portland is always right now. Things may be imperfect, and we may not always get things right the first time, but we're striving for transformation, and we need to lean into the discomfort of change for the betterment of everyone in our community. With that, it seems only fitting that we look to our city's future with the clarity of 2020 vision and embark on a process of reviewing how our city's government is organized and how it works. We're here today to kick off the process of reviewing Portland's charter. Today's session will ground us, and the agenda is on the screen, as you can see, in the timeline and the goals of this process, in the basic tenets of our existing charter, in the lessons learned from previous efforts. We'll be joined by Anita Yap, who's the chair of the 2010 Charter Commission, and Shelley Romero, a fellow commissioner, both of whom are very familiar to all of us. And we'll learn how this effort can amplify and continue a community conversation about the Portland City, how Portland City government can better serve all of our residents, and importantly, why this matters for all Portlanders. It's the council's responsibility to impanel a charter commission that is representative of the diversity of our city and to hold a process that upholds the 6 core values we adopted 2 weeks ago. And those 6 core values are on the screen in front of us. It's also the council's responsibility to assist the work of the commission without impeding their process of examining how we can potentially build a form of government that engages the diverse voices of this city, is representative of our distinct geographic community, and builds a system that ensures that our city services function equitably across all of our neighborhoods. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge that these are extraordinary times. As I like to say, unprecedented is the new status quo. While it's the city council's responsibility to seat the commission by the end of the year, we also want to ensure that the commission has the time and the space to ensure that we're having a thoughtful dialogue about the future of our city. You'll see timelines outlined in this presentation, but we'll adapt to the needs of our commission and community as we move forward. So with that, I'd like to introduce Shoshana Oppenheim from the Office of the CAO to kick off this meeting. Good morning, Shoshana. How are you today?
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Shoshana Oppenheim. I'm manager of the Strategic Projects and Opportunities team in the Office of the CAO. And we have a lot of presenters today, so I think it's a helpful reminder to use your mute button when you're not talking and to use the chat function or raise your hand if you have questions. So what we're here to talk about is the Charter Commission. And when we're talking about the Charter Commission, we're really talking about continuing a conversation that's been happening over years and decades about how the city of Portland is meeting or is not meeting the needs of its diverse communities. It's continuing a conversation about access to services, about our decision-making, and our ability to be nimble in the face of emergencies. In addition to the 6 values laid out by the mayor, this project is grounded in the principles of equity, engagement, and representation. These principles are guiding our work when we're developing an outreach strategy, designing our application process, selecting members of the commission to represent our diverse communities, and specifically, this project will continue the community's conversation about Portland's form of government, the way that we elect our representatives, the number of members of this city council, and the challenges that we face as a city as a result of the charter that was adopted over 100 years ago. That was a time when Portland was, the Portland that we know today was just not even an idea, and that the population was approximately 1/3 of today's population. In alignment with our principles.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Commissioner Hardesty had a quick question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you, Mayor. So I just want to ask from the beginning, it looks like we are about to tell this Charter Commission what their job is. And I'm concerned about that because that's not our job, is to tell them what to look at in our governance document. And so I just wanted to stop you early and get some assessment about what you think the role of the Charter Commission is.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Commissioner Hardesty. We believe that the Charter Commission is an independent body. I'm only elevating the questions and the issues that the community has already raised, not dictating that these are the issues that we want them to look at, only anticipating that these are conversations that are currently happening in our community. So absolutely, and I think that you'll see later in our presentation that we're absolutely in alignment, that the commission needs independence. And I think that you heard that from the mayor's earlier comments.
Thank you for that. But the first document I saw has a list of areas that somebody believes that the Charter Commission should take on. And I just don't want to set the expectation that we are going to set a Charter Commission and we're going to give them a list of things that we want them to do, because that's not the role of a Charter Commission. And so I'm just concerned about how we present information and whether these are ideas that they could consider as compared to these are conversations that are happening. Because I believe these conversations have happened some places, but they haven't happened in a lot of communities yet. So I would not want to anticipate what the Charter Commission prioritizes to work on.
Absolutely. I think that's a point well taken, and I'll make sure that it's reflected that way.
If I could just jump in on that one, Commissioner Hardesty, I don't think we need to worry about that. When we had the 2011 Charter Commission, Mayor Potter, former Mayor Potter, attended the very first meeting and told them that they are the most powerful people in the city and that they could do whatever they wanted to do. And that's what they proceeded to do. I do, though, believe that I am also a citizen of this community and have some things that I would like to ask them to think about addressing. I agree, though, we need to be very clear that we need to select Charter Commission members who are going to be open to hearing from all manner of different people, including, once in a while, the folks on the City Council. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Fritz. You're absolutely right. I expect that I will go in front of the Charter Commission and make my case for a whole host of issues as well. But I just don't want us to set expectations for the areas that they will look, since their charge is to look anywhere they want to and to address any issues that rise to the level that they have a majority of their committee supporting. So I think we're all on the same page. It's just words are powerful, and once you put them on paper, people take them as fact. So I just want to make sure any information that goes out to the public is clear about what the expectations are for the members of this commission.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, next slide, please. Right now, we're building the foundation for this important conversation about the future of Portland. By helping everyone understand what's in a charter, the powers and limitations of these foundational documents, and why this commission can provide some of the changes that the community has been demanding to see. In the fall, we'll seat a commission. They will set their own rules of procedure, develop their own work plan, build an engagement strategy that will inform and involve the communities we serve. And like Commissioner Hardesty just mentioned, they will determine the topics that they would like to examine. This schedule is built around the expectation that the Charter Commission will make recommendations that require a vote of the people and strives to have those recommendations finalized by January or February of 2020. This is an election cycle that's expected to have a lot of interest due to the election of the governor and the Multnomah County chair. And if Oregon is allotted an additional congressional seat, that will be the first time that the voters can vote to fill this seat. This is the most conservative timeline. It's just an outline, but it allows for the greatest flexibility on when recommendations can be referred to the ballot. Next slide. The charter outlines that the council seat a commission of 12 individuals, where each member of the city council appoints 4 persons. What aligns with our principles is that this process be open to the public, that we use a single application process, that it's well publicized and distributed, and importantly, that we remove barriers to participation. We are expecting that COVID-19 will be with us, and we will need to hold our meetings virtually. We are coordinating with leaders of the community to make sure that our outreach and engagement plan will use the best practices for engaging underrepresented voices when we need to practice social distancing. We are striving to do our best by providing the commission members each a stipend each fiscal year of $500, which will remove barriers when you need childcare or you need to improve internet connectivity to participate in community meetings. The council has approved funding for translation and interpretation services, as well as service to increase access to participation. In alignment with our principles of equity, engagement, and representation, we are applying a one city approach, which is different than previous commissions. We think that this approach of a shared effort with a unified equity lens, applying consistent criteria, will lead to an effective, responsive, cohesive commission focused on the need to modernize our charter so that Portland can solve the problems that face our city today and beyond. Council has already shared with me that you would like to use the requirement of using demographic information and creating a representative commission as a floor, not a ceiling, for BIPOC members of the community, and that you are committed to ensuring that our Native American and tribal communities are strongly represented at the table. Commissioner Hardesty, as you've mentioned before, was a member of the 2010 Charter Commission. Today, next slide, please. Today we'll hear from 2 additional members of the former commission. And I think that we will all agree that it's critical that the commission is independent and that they are empowered to do the work outlined in the charter. As the mayor said earlier, the council's responsibility is to assist the commission without impeding their process of examination of the charter. The commission has the ability to build a future Portland that engages diverse voices and is representative of our city's residents and ensures that our city services are provided equitably in every neighborhood. What aligns with our principles is that a commission reflects issues raised by the community, and they are empowered to resolve the structural changes of our charter. Keelan, to stay on this slide. I've been talking quite enough, but I want you.
Stop you and ask the
Oh
question.
yeah, absolutely.
As I look at your timeline, unless we've changed the rules, I thought that once the Charter Commission had a majority vote on any issue, it went to the next ballot. And so based on your timeline, the expectation is that everything will go to a January, February process. And so that's one question. I was on the last Charter Commission, and you didn't need to wait to a time certain to send things to the ballot. So I want to verify that. And then the second question I had was around, there is no need for the charter to make recommendations to the council. The city council has no authority to change or recommend any changes to ballot measures that the Charter Review Commission moves forward. So why is this just a report back, assuming they've done their work? What is the city council thing for?
Sure, thank you. So I'll walk a little bit through the schedule. So after the commission is seated, one of the concerns that we heard in previous conversations was that people didn't have enough information about where the commission was going. So the report to council in October is really just a check-in. Are you successful? Do you need more time? Where are you? Do you expect to bring a report to council in January, February? It's like a check-in, just where are you in the process? The charter, as I understand it, says that anything in their report where they have agreement of 15 or more members is referred by the council to the ballot. And then anything that has support of 12 or more members may be referred to the ballot, but that gets to the ballot through referral to the city council. So they make a report. Those items that have sufficient support of 15 or more members are would not automatically, but go through the process of being referred. What I hear in your question is, does the city council have the authority to change what is reported? And my understanding is that if it is referred to this, if it is reported to the city council that there is support of 15 or more members, that item gets referred by city council to the ballot. And then if there's less support, the council has an opportunity to elevate those concerns. Maybe it's something that was important to the council, but it only garnered support of 12 members. Those items could then be referred to the ballot. And then, of course, the city council can refer anything that a majority of the city council members chooses to support. So if there's something that the council didn't look at, or the commission didn't look at, let's say they did not look at vacancies, or they did not look at, there's a concern about weatherization that's currently in our existing charter. Those items could be referred by the council alone without the charter commission. But luckily we have Maya Hyam on the line. She's going to walk us through a lot more about the charter and the requirements if I haven't answered your questions now. I'm sorry, if I haven't answered Commissioner Hardesty's questions.
Shoshana, this is Maya.
Commissioner Fritz has a question.
So I'm really concerned. Thank you, Mayor. I'm really concerned about this slide, which presupposes that this commission form of government is going to change, and I am very troubled by that. I know that there's a lot of community conversations. There's also a lot of conversation now that the Open and Accountable Elections program has proven so successful that is this still the best way to improve the demographics of the city council? So I'm just really disturbed by this slide that moves straight into let's change the form of government when the voters have said, no, let's not, 9 times.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. What I didn't get a chance to introduce this slide, which says that we were hoping in today's council session to just outline the timeline for the project, give you some parameters of what we expect when the application is going to be launched, and to hear from community members on why it's important to them to have this conversation, and also elements of advancing the conversation. There's a lot to talk about. There are many conversations happening in the community about some policy questions. We actually wanted to save those policy questions, understanding that this council would have interest in learning about what those conversations are, just so that you could be in lockstep or understanding the issues. We're going to save that for August when we have a 5th commission member. This by no means says that this are the topics for the August work session. These are just topics that we understand that there is interest in. If these are not the right topics for our August work session, I definitely appreciate your feedback saying either no, there's no need for an August work session on the policy issues that the commission may be interested in, or we'd like to hear about different issues. So absolutely, this is all to gain your feedback and interest.
So Shauna,
thank you. I appreciate that. If I could just respond, because that was my question. I appreciate that, and I do think that having some council work sessions is a good thing for wider community members may tune into that as well as into the Charter Commission's process. So certainly I appreciate that we're going to have the conversations and look at the all of the issues. It was basically just I was very concerned about we shouldn't presuppose that we're going to do something because that's up to the Charter Commission to decide.
Agreed, absolutely.
My apologies, Commissioner Fritz. Yes, I just want to support what Commissioner Fritz says. When you put something on paper, it has power. And I don't want us to in any way try to influence the major issues that the Charter Review Commission takes on. Because again, they can look at anything and everything they want to. And I don't think it's our job to try to narrow down their scope or to try to get them to look at one thing or another. So I would say this is fine for an internal work session, but I would not want any of this material released publicly because I would not want people to assume that we're sending this Charter Commission down a path that we are not sending them down. They get to go down whatever path they want. And so as we start recruiting people, the material will matter what we're asking people to sign on to. And I would suggest that we not identify policy areas that we think as examples, right? That we talk about what the role of the Charter Commission is and why they're so vital to the future of the city of Portland. And so I just want to make sure that I'm as clear as possible that I don't want people coming in ready to change the form of government, because that means they're not going to be open to other ideas that may be just as meaningful as other people may think. So that's a compelling argument. Now I'm going to give the counter argument
as is often the case. First of all, let me acknowledge what Commissioners Fritz and Hardesty said that I agree with wholeheartedly, which is the Charter Review Commission is independent, and the Charter Review Commission can decide to either take up an issue or not take up an issue or take up issues we haven't even contemplated that they might take up. In fact, I actually hope that there is a healthy discussion on the Charter Review Commission, and we're going to hear from some people who've done this previously. But I guess where I differ is I think it would be, while I agree with the independence, I think it would also be, I can't think of the exact right word that I want to use at this particular moment, except to say, obviously, the structure of government, the form of government is going to come up. It's been discussed extensively over the course of the last 2 years. There are no fewer than 2 other independent efforts outside of City Hall to look at the charter review. I would be concerned that there would be 1 or 2, or, well, I'm not concerned about 1, but there might be 2 or 3 competing charter amendments coming to the voters in 2021 that would be addressing the structure of government. So I've been out there saying, hey, if this discussion about the form of government is something the community is truly interested in, they want to have it, I would rather it come in this forum and consolidate those efforts into one effort to share information, to share ideas, to share expertise, to share the power of convening that the Charter Review Commission has the ability to do, rather than there being a bunch of fragmented issues out there. So while I support what my colleagues are saying with regard to the independence of this commission, I don't think we should shy away from the reality that the form of government is going to be front and center. I find it hard to believe that after everything that's been discussed in this community, that they would simply choose to take a pass on this important question. Certainly they have the right to take a pass if they choose to take a pass, and it shouldn't be a condition for anybody's participation on the Charter Review Commission, but I think we should be well prepared for the reality that form of government is what they're going to focus on.
So I appreciate that, Mayor. I will just respectfully disagree, because I will tell you there are many communities that don't know what form of government we have, and they don't know what the divide in government is, or where to get their needs met from which government. So I think the deeper that we reach out to folks who have not traditionally participated in these kind of processes, you might be really surprised to find out what's foremost on people's mind. I do believe it will come up. I just don't think it's our job to dictate that that's something they should focus on. I'm sure it will come up in meetings. I just don't think it's going to be number one on people's mind.
Well, we'll see. If a few months as police commissioner might change your attitude.
I'll bet you $1. We'll see.
All right. Thank you, Shoshana. And that was a good discussion, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And where I'm hearing the intersect for all of us is that ironclad commitment that this is an independent review.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that was really helpful. My intention with this offering of the work session is really just to amplify the issues that I'm hearing about from the community when I'm talking to our partner organizations and people who have been involved in this conversation. So it's really just to amplify the conversations that I've been hearing and making sure that you have the best information about the conversation that I'm hearing. So we can refine this list and move forward. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So our next steps are to launch the selection process and use the power of social media and our communications plan to share the information about the Charter Commission and work with council to understand your priorities for this body of work. This work session has been really helpful for me to get crystal clear on some of your expectations in terms of communicating with the public and to be really mindful about what we put out there so that we're not limiting or presupposing the outcome. But it would be helpful to know if we're on the right track or the wrong track, if there's any priorities that we've missed that we should that is shared by this council, and what we can do to amplify our reach of our recruitment. I'll share the information with you so we can make sure that we have a diverse pool for your selection of the charter commissions. And of course, I'm always available for additional conversations outside of this work session. If you'd like to provide me any more information about what you'd like to hear from us next in August. Next slide, please. I want to make sure that you and the future charter commissioners know that we have provided resources to support this project, and that we've dedicated senior level staff to ensure the success of this project. So joining me from the Office of the CAO is Jian Kim. She's an additional strategic project manager that we have on spot. Additionally, Diana Shiplet will be providing administrative and program support. Maya Hayam is our city attorney, providing legal analysis and any additional support. We also have from our communications team, Francisca Garafia and Laura Oppenheimer. So I think that you'll notice that this is a change from how we've staffed this charter commission. We're taking it very seriously. We appreciate your support on the budget request that we had for this project. And of course, there'll be an additional budget request for the next fiscal year. So with that, I'd like to introduce Maya Hayam, who is our city attorney, and she'll give you an overview of the charter. So we're all kind of in agreement as to what the charter is in comparison to some of our other foundational documents. So Maya, next slide, please.
Thank you, Shoshana. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, commissioners. And actually, let's just go to the next slide.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. I have the screen turned off. My kids are turning photobombing into a competitive sport, so hopefully this will decrease their amusement. So Portland city government derives its power from the city charter, which is a written grant of authority from the people of Portland to the city, authorizing the city to exercise the rights given to it by the people. Not every city's authority comes directly from the people. In fact, in many states in the nation, cities derive all their power from the state government and can only exercise those powers explicitly given to cities by state law. Next slide. In fact, Portland's first charter, when the city incorporated in 1851, was granted by Oregon's territorial government. And Oregon was not granted statehood itself until 1859, a full 8 years after Portland's first charter. Oregon cities continue to be creatures of the state, just like most of the nation, until 1906, when the voters of Oregon adopted a constitutional amendment that granted the people the right to draft and amend their own city charters, independent of state approval. And those constitutional amendments are commonly known as Home Rule. And in 1913, Portland voters approved a new Home Rule charter that also adopted our current form of government. Next slide. The relationship between Portland's charter and city code are functionally equivalent to the Oregon Constitution and state statutes. The charter and the Constitution set forth fundamental principles, while the city code and state statutes are systems of rules that regulate behavior. In other words, Portland's first charter created the city as a legal entity and authorized city powers, while the city code mostly deals with day-to-day operations. This hierarchy is reinforced when you look at what's required to amend the charter versus the code. The charter, which again sets forth fundamental principles, can only be amended by a majority of Portland voters. The city code, which again focuses on day-to-day operations, can be amended by a majority of the city council. Next slide, please. Many organizations have drafted model charters and best practices, and there's general consensus around the following best practices for a charter. First, a charter should function as a city's constitution, meaning it identifies basic, broad fundamentals of city government and permits good governance and accountability. Second, charter should be concise. And finally, Charters should avoid the need for frequent amendment. For example, construction permit fees require frequent amendment to keep up with inflation and recover the city's administrative costs, and should therefore be set in city code or administrative rule and not in the city charter. Next slide, please. So if a charter follows those 3 best practices, again, it identifies fundamental principles, it is concise, and it avoids the need for frequent amendment, what does that charter look like? The League of Oregon Cities has a model charter that attempts to answer that question, and its provisions include names and boundaries, council, and the model defaults to a city manager form of government, and that's exclusively because that's the predominant form of government in Oregon. Legislative authority, administrative authority, quasi-judicial authority, elections, appointive officers, personnel, public improvements, and miscellaneous. And that's it. Next slide, please. So does Portland's charter embody those 3 best practices? Does it identify fundamental principles? Is it concise? And does it avoid the need for frequent amendment? Some deviations are expected to address individual city needs. No one charter looks the same. That's because of home rule. The beauty and power of home rule is all communities get to decide what goes in their charter themselves. We have 2 deviations that are most commonly identified. First, we talked about this many times, our form of government. And second, our charter includes a number of day-to-day operations that are typically in city code and here in our charter. And for example, Shoshana already mentioned we have weatherization project prohibition in our charter and a lengthy utility franchising process, which I know the council is familiar with. And this is a great example of a requirement that gets a little stale over time because the utility franchising publication requirement requires the entire full length of a franchise ordinance, which can run to 30 pages, be published in full in a newspaper of general circulation with at least 15,000. So again, that 15,000 number is the one that you wouldn't necessarily want to have in the charter because it does frequently become stale.
Maya, Commissioner Hardesty has a question.
Oh, yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm dying to know why there's a prohibition on some weatherization. What is that? How does that end up in the charter?
It's a great question and one that I don't know. I don't have the personal background on that. I can find out and report on that background at the August work session.
Yeah, that would be a good one to, because that apparently was not a policy issue. That was something else.
So whether the deviations are a best practice is really a question best answered by the Charter Commission. And the City Council will be appointing them in the next few months. And if there are no further questions for me, I think there are 2 former members of Portland's Charter Commission who will provide insight on how the council can support the upcoming commission's work.
Thank you. Appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. And now I'd like to turn it over to Anita Yap and Shelley Romero. Can we have the next slide, please?
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Mayor and City Council. And I think to start off with, I'd like to thank Commissioner Fritz actually appointed me as co-chair of the Charter Commission. And Shoshana had to remind me it was 10 years ago, so that's a long time. But what I'd like to say is that I am familiar with charters. I worked in other cities around Oregon and understand the importance of charters and how they get changed. So that was, thank you, Maya, for that. And I think in particular, I'd like to just right off answer, or at least my understanding of the Charter Commission's kind of autonomy. And it is if the Charter Commission has not just a majority, but a unanimous decision for an initiative, it bypasses the City Council and goes directly to the ballot. So unless things have changed, that was my recollection from 10 years ago. So that's the important component of kind of the autonomy that the Charter Commission has that, as you know, no other advisory committee in the city has. And so this is a really important group of folks. And so the co-chair, Mark White, and I put in an awful lot of time and effort just to make sure this was really successful. And, we met with all the city councilors. We met with the auditor's office. We actually did a lot of work to get to know and work with all the charter commission members. And they were an amazing group of folks, around the community. Really, really had a commitment to do a good job with this. And when we were appointed, we were only assigned to do a short component of a charter change, and that was our assignment. But being the facilitator as co-chair, the commission wasn't going to have that. So I know that started out not on the best foot with a number of city councilors. But, for me as a community member and wanting to make sure that this time, 10 years ago, we were able to really look at what the important things are. And I think as you saw, that there were a number of things in the charter that were like, how do they get there and why are they there? And so there needed to be a lot of, explanation and understanding for the Charter Commission to kind of get grounded. So, we had Mayor Potter come, Commissioner Fritz came and talked with us, Mayor Adams as well. And anyway, so there's a lot to learn about the charter. And so I think folks don't need to know a lot about it, but I think there's really the representation is really important. As you know, the challenges we had that we didn't have any administrative support or political support. So Mark and I ended up having to figure out how to take notes, get things posted. And thank you to Commissioner Fritz for allowing her commission website to be posting information on that. That was really helpful as well. And I think in particular, we did not have a lot of community support. And when I say that we were not able, because we didn't have a budget or the resources to actually reach out to the community to, one, help them understand the importance of the charter, but then also to engage in them, in what they're interested in. And, there were a number of initiatives that came up. Folks on the commission had a lot of great expertise on, utilities and rank voting and things like that. So those came up as, things that we talked about, but I really believe that we did not have the opportunity to really understand what the needs and issues of the community were. So what I would like to say is that—
Anita, I'm sorry to interrupt. I apologize. Commissioner Hardesty, do you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I wanted to ask Ms. Yap a question, if I may. Welcome. And I came in halfway through that 2010 Charter Commission as a replacement member. And I really appreciate what you said, Anita, about not actually having the political support to be as independent as that Charter Commission should have been. And you said you had to do all your own minutes and you had to do your own posting. So you actually didn't even have staff that was assigned to the Charter Commission at that time?
I think we had an intern from the mayor's office, but he was an intern. And so he had never taken meeting notes. And he was a young person that was really, did his best, but he didn't know how to do it. So we ended up having to do it ourselves, or assigning that and doing those sorts of things, logistics and meetings and polling commission members. And
now, if I remember correctly, Anita, the public was told that this particular Charter Commission was just going to deal with administrative cleanup, right? It wasn't going to deal with any major policy issues, because the next year, another Charter Commission was going to be put in place that would deal with policy issues. And as you said, your committee rebelled and started looking at policy issues from the beginning. Did that damage the reputation of your committee, that the political support was not there, and the political support was sending mixed messages to the public about the importance of the commission that you were co-chairing?
That's a good question, Commissioner Hardesty. I would say yes, as far as damage. Actually, it's set up as a kind of an adversarial relationship. And, that was one of my recommendations related to the relationship of the City Council and the Charter Commission, because like I said, this commission, if they have a unanimous vote, it bypasses the City Council. And I think some folks on the council at the time understood that. And, I think it's the power dynamic as well. So that it just started out adversarial, and, these folks were appointed by city council members, but they were strong community members. And as a co-chair facilitating that, we had to do what we really felt like we needed to do. So I think listening to the discussion about some of the things that are already issues that are preset, as you recommend, or that was listed on Shoshana's PowerPoint, were things that came up before. And I know the City Club also had taken on some research projects as well. But from my perspective, it's a whole new world right now. And so I don't think we should presuppose probably those things are going to come up. But I would also like to recommend that as you're going to do your solicitation for members, that you actually start your community engagement now, or when you're doing that solicitation, to help people understand the importance of the charter, what's in it. And that will then lead to people that are understanding a little bit more about that. But it's also the beginning of community engagement to talk about how, what's important to the community. So I think that's really important. And then also the thing about the relationship of the council supporting the commission on the initiatives that come. And I think if there are some technical operating issues in the charter that the city council sees needs to be addressed, I think that's important to share, because you all have to deal with that. And I think those are important things that could be some low-hanging fruit, but I don't think presupposing what the issues will be, unless there's something in particular each of you have as something that you're interested in, is good to share, but also just developing a different relationship at the very beginning will really help with this commission.
Anita, before you push on and before I get to Commissioner Fritz, who has her hand raised, first of all, I just want to acknowledge this council has already addressed the administrative piece. Our budget includes substantial funding for the Charter Review Commission, because we had heard loudly and clearly that there was not adequate administrative support the last time around. We want to make sure that is the case this time around. So I just wanted you to be aware that despite all of our budget cuts, we did include funding for the charter review process. And before I call on Commissioner Fritz, our attorney Maya had a clarification with regard to the ballot process that she can't raise her hand. So I've been pinged to allow her to speak briefly on this subject. Maya, and then I'll get to Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick clarification, there are 20 members of the commission. If 15 or more members vote in the affirmative for a particular recommendation, that recommendation has to go to a public hearing process before the council, and then it goes directly to the voters without council approval at the next primary or general election that is at least 120 days after the date the recommendations are presented to city council. So the sort of a super majority, there's a public hearing before council, but then that recommendation will go directly to the ballot. If there's a majority affirmative vote for a particular recommendation, less than 15 members, it will go forward to the city council, and the city council may debate it, change it, refer it to the voters or not as council sees fit.
Thanks, Maya. My recollection is rather foggy after 10 years, but.
Well, Anita, we're thrilled you're here and you're sharing your experience. It's really important for us to hear, so we appreciate it. Commissioner Fritz, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I'm looking at the resolution that when we appointed the Charter Commission, it was December 8th of 2010. And one of the things, and let's remember that that was still in the depths of the recession. And so one of the lessons learned, and I appreciate, Mayor, what you just said in terms of the budget, one of the lessons learned was definitely you cannot do this. It cannot be done without a budget and staffing, which we knew that was going to be a problem and didn't have the money at the time to do it. So another of the measures in the resolution back in the end of 2010 was that we would make sure that there would be funding every 10 years. I've requested several times that we have $50,000 ongoing in the budget so that every 10 years we'll have 500,000 to, and that it wouldn't be dependent on whether the council has the money at that particular time. So I encourage you to think about that. The question I have for Anita is that one of the things that the council requested the commission to do was advise the council on how to set up an inclusive citywide process to seek and select applicants for the next Charter Commission. And so I don't know whether Shoshana is going to go back to that process afterwards, but Anita, I'd be interested to hear your recommendation on how do we set up a commission that reflects the richness of our community while still acknowledging that 5 people on the council each get to pick 4.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Fritz. I have to say I can't recall what we did 10 years ago as a recommendation, but I think from what I remember from our commission, they're an amazing group of people. I think the concern that I had, because there were a lot of really good community leaders, some of them were so busy, we were not able to engage them as much as we could. Actually, there's probably several members that just couldn't make any of the meetings. And that became a real problem and another conflict with whichever commissioner appointed that person. And we tried really hard to do that. So I think that's important. But I think we were all appointed pretty quickly in December. So I don't think there was much of a recruitment going on. But the folks on the commission were an amazing group. So they all did a great job. So I think thinking about, as you're looking for the, recruitment and applications, is to really set up what you want to see represented on the commission as far as range of viewpoints. I heard some, hearing Native American voices, geographic folks, other folks that maybe equity at the center who have not necessarily been involved, but understanding that lived experience is just as important as policy experience as well. I mean, that really makes a big difference. So helping unpack and understand what the charter is really important. And if you can begin that with the members of the Charter Commission, I think that's really a good way to think about it. I think also the issue related to, we've talked about transparency, but I want to add the word accountability as well, because the folks that were appointed to the Charter Commission, and I believe the ones that will be as well this time, have an accountability to their communities and other folks. And so I think as part of the transparency, there's should be an accountability component related to that. Yeah, I think those, I think setting up that as part of when you're looking for your applications on what you're looking for. And in particular, like I said, people who have the ability to spend the time. We spend an amazing amount of time, and we're all volunteer folks and really committed. And like I said, some folks are just way too busy that couldn't do it, that we really missed out. So I think those are some of the recommendations that I would have. But I think in particular, the relationship, because of the autonomy, on how that needs to be supported by the council. But I also think the commission really does understand that at some point, they would need support of the city council for some of the things they bring forward. So when we had met before talking with Shoshana, that's a really important first step, is to look at the relationship between the appointed Charter Commission and the City Council on, relationship building in particular. So it's a two-way thing on understanding their autonomy and also the need that as you as elected leaders leading our city. So if you have any other questions, I think that's the end of my presentation, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and kind of re-jog my memory from 10 years ago. And it's great to see this going forward.
Well, Anita, as somebody who can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, I think you've done outstandingly well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Great.
Any other questions, let me know.
So thank you again, Anita. And now I'd like to invite Shelley Romero to provide some information about her experiences. Thank you, Shelley.
Welcome, Shelley.
Did we lose Shelley?
There we are. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we
You're
can.
good to go.
Awesome.
Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, City Council. And thanks for the opportunity to provide insights into my experiences as an appointed commissioner for the 2011 Charter Commission. I want to first convey my gratitude to the 2011 Charter Commission co-chairs Anita Yap and Mark White for their significant investment of time, dedication, and leadership. As Anita said, they spent countless hours preparing for Charter Commission meetings, talking individually with Charter Commission members, and meeting with members of City Council for regular briefings. And I also want to thank the members of the 2011 Charter Commission and to express my gratitude for all who came to testify before us with ideas for suggested changes to the charter. One important aspect of the 2011 Charter Commission that deserves recognition that has been successfully implemented was the formation of the Portland Utility Board, a community oversight body for the Portland Water Bureau and the Bureau of Environmental Services and City Council management of those public utility bureaus. This is a great example of good government and transparency, and the 2011 Charter Commission and City Council did the right thing by putting the Portland Utility Board in place. This is a prime example of government and community working together to make our city function more transparently, and it's an example that we should replicate. My experience as a 2011 Charter Commission fell short of meeting my expectations, and that is a theme I've heard from many fellow Charter Commissioners and from the members of the public and stakeholders. That said, I am encouraged that City Council is taking a critical look back to understand what transpired, identify lessons learned, and move forward with a much improved process in 2020. I was asked to participate in this briefing by providing some reflections and lessons learned. So my observations and experiences are not intended to be overly critical, but to shine the light on what transpired so we can work together to make it better in year 2020. To begin with, City Council waited too long to begin the process for appointing commission members. In the charter, it states that council must appoint and convene a charter commission every 10 years, but because of a rushed appointment process, council reached out to community and constituency leaders to serve on the charter commission. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with doing this, it likely limited service on the charter commission by others who could or would have also provided valuable perspectives at the time. As Anita and others have mentioned, there wasn't sufficient funding to staff and operate the Charter Commission effectively in 2011. In 2011, a city intern, God bless him, was assigned as our designated staff person to set up room logistics, get out the agendas, organize public testimonials, coordinate with the co-chairs, take notes, and serve as a liaison between the Charter Commission and the city legal office to clarify questions. The intern, I assume, was responsible for reporting the progress on our work to City Council. Alex did his best, but he confided in me on several occasions. He felt he was in over his head. He needed more support, more experience, more mentorship. As a Latina, I feel very badly that the city set up Alex as a young Latino to fail. This is unacceptable, and we can and need to do better. When it comes to staffing the Charter Commission, Council should appoint a small seasoned group of people to staff the upcoming 2020 Charter Commission to ensure the Commission's work is valued and it functions effectively. And Council must adequately invest the time and effort to support those staffing the Charter Commission so that they are not set up for failure. In 2011, City Council also made clear that the Charter Commission's scope was very limited. We were told that we were going to do a lot of work in a short amount of time and that it was mainly to look at housekeeping issues, and that later a second Charter Commission would be appointed and be allotted more time and resources to conduct a more in-depth and an expanded scope. As a result, there was no entertainment of substantive changes, which were and are very much needed to advance equity. In fact, many who came to publicly testify before the Charter Commission brought forward issues and suggested changes that would have advanced equity. Instead, it felt much like blatant disregard. And furthermore, I felt like I was put in a no-win situation. I'd been appointed to represent a constituency in a way that I felt disingenuous, lacked authenticity and transparency through no fault of my own. This unequivocally compromises my personal and professional value system, standard of conduct, and my ethics. I now want to pivot to what we can do going forward. Year 2020 is an opportunity for a new start. The public appetite for any government process that is short on transparency, authenticity, independence, accountability, respect, and support is not something Portlanders will accept. I have recently learned that this city council is taking a different path this time by appointing senior staff and providing adequate budget to ensure the work of the 2020 Charter Commission is valued and it functions effectively. That's really encouraging. I have hope that this time the city council will reflect on the past and take these lessons into the future to allow for enough time, apply sufficient funding, and not limit the scope to ensure the 2020 Charter Commission can conduct meaningful work that we can all feel good about. We all have to work together to ensure that the Charter Commission can carry out its work, keeping in line with lending a critical eye to what the city's core functions are, how it's organized, and how it carries out its work, because these issues are ones we should all care about, regardless of whether we are members of City Council, Charter Commission members, stakeholders, or community members at large. We must invest the time, the effort, and the resources with fairness and intentionality and apply an equity lens to reach a common goal, that the City of Portland serve every Portlander to the best of its ability, and that we recognize that the City of Portland as a government entity ultimately belongs to the people. Thank you.
Shelley, thank you for that. Thank you for being willing to come here and share your perspective. That's important and it's powerful, and you're right. And again, you're underscoring the importance of both the independence and the transparency, as well as having the administrative capacity be there. So thank you for all of those. And thank you for your service. I know that was not an easy process, and I appreciate the honesty with which you're sharing that, because I think people need to hear that perspective.
I'm
good to see you, Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to add my thanks to Shelley as well. Such a thorough report back. I remember that painful Charter Commission and am thrilled that we won't be repeating that process again. So grateful for your service and your support and helping us make it much better for this next group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Anita or Shelley? I just want to.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing some time with us this morning. We appreciate it.
I just want to, again, offer my thanks. I appreciate both Anita and Shelley. They've been great thought partners on our developing our work going forward and on so many projects that we've worked together over the years. So thank you for your leadership. And now I'd like to introduce Colin Jones, who is a member of the City Club's Board of Governors. And he's going to talk a little bit about how we hope to amplify conversations that have been happening in the community and continuing those conversations with our work. So Colin, can we have the next slide, please? Elin, thank you.
Colin, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners Hardesty, Udaley, and Fritz. Really appreciate your time. A little bit of history to begin. So at the most fundamental level, City Club was founded as an anti-corruption organization. In 1916, a group of young leaders came together because they felt the city wasn't responding to the needs of everyday people. It's a line I use a lot to introduce City Club. But to be candid, our founders were primarily concerned that older white men in power weren't responding to the interests of younger white men without power. But a lot has changed in the last 100 years. Today, City Club is a multiracial, multi-generational center for civic engagement, research, and public dialogue. One thing that hasn't changed is our focus on accountability and transparency in government. So I'm really heartened that your time today started with questions about what conversations are already happening in the community. Over the last 5 years of engagement with City Club, I've had the opportunity to have dozens, sometimes it feels like hundreds of conversations about Portland's system of governance. I have one takeaway from these conversations, and it's what I want to share with you today. Portland community leaders, advocates, neighborhood associations, and local business leaders are all seem to be leaning in the same direction, toward change. In my roles at City Club, I've been lucky to both help create space for this conversation to take place and to hear the growing chorus. But City Club's engagement on the topic of charter review process predates my tenure with the organization by about 80 years. The frequency with which we've researched Portland's form of government over the last century appears second to maybe only water fluoridation. So the first 4 times City Club tackled this issue in 1933, 56, 66, and 99, our research committees recommended a change. When we returned to the issue in 2002 and 2007, our research committees ended up recommending against changing the form of government, both times due to insufficient community process and concerns about the details of the proposed reforms. The 2002 committee specifically identified the charter review process as the right way to bring community leadership into play. I share this history to highlight that there have been questions, you could say critiques, of the commission form of government almost since its arrival in Portland, and those questions have increased in frequency and volume in recent years. So when we launched our most recent initiative in 2016, 3 things were at the forefront of our minds. First, a deep awareness of the inequities and challenges faced by the city. In their 2010 report, An Unsettling Profile, the Coalition of Communities of Color highlighted the lack of representation for communities of color at all levels of government. The report observed, quote, targeted initiatives are required at all levels of governance in Multnomah County to ensure that the overwhelming whiteness of those elected to public office reverses trend. Second, we saw that witnesses in our research process and speakers on our stage have been saying the same things over and over in the last several years. The challenges that the city faces are not the fault of a single leader, and those challenges will not be solved by tinkering. In conversations all over Portland, we heard that people believe that fundamental and systemic reform is needed to increase equitable outcomes, achieve a legislative body that is reflective of our changed and changing community, and effectively deliver services in every part of the city. Finally, our recent research on this topic was primarily in response to ballot measures over sort of the preceding years. And we viewed that approach as insufficient. We saw a real need to engage deeply over the course of several years. So we did just that, convening our study committee on the form of government in 2016. City Club's approach to developing research committees, it might be a little different than academic research that you're more familiar with. The goal is to seek general citizen engagement, not policy experts or advocates in a field. The committee recruited for this research started with no prescribed positions, only a set of questions. They're a diverse group in terms of race, gender, and political experience. The questions that guided their inquiry were, what is the most effective form of government for Portland residents? What is most equitable? And what does this tell us about how city council members should be elected? How many should there be? And what form of voting should be used to elect city council members? Our committee conducted an extensive literature review and interviews with individuals ranging from elected leaders, political strategists, BIPOC community leaders, and national experts on elections. I want to stress that the focus of the research was not how to change Portland's government, but instead to assess how effective and equitable the government is and to explore what changes might bring about more positive outcomes. The conclusion of that research charge was the need for change. That growing community-led drive towards change was evident when we released the research early 2019, bringing together hundreds of Portlanders for the first time, a dozen events specifically focused on exploring the implications of our current form of government and the potential upsides to deep and meaningful charter review. What struck me then and now is the diversity of speakers who highlighted the challenges they saw with our current manner of governing. And I use the word diversity in its broadest sense. The speakers came from many racial and cultural backgrounds, ranged in age from 29 to late 60s, and included neighborhood activists, auditors, accountants, advocates, researchers, real estate developers, and former public officials. I'm not sure exactly how many policy initiatives that group would agree on, but I got the sense that it wouldn't be very many, besides the need to manage our amazing city differently. Following the research launch in 2019, we immediately formed a subsequent study committee on voting methods. Those findings will be published this summer in a new report focused on alternative voting methods like ranked choice voting. But the preview I'll give you now is that 2 key themes from our first research project are resurfacing here. First, a strong consensus that our current form of government isn't working for many Portlanders. And second, any comprehensive overhaul to that form of government should happen through and alongside an extensive community engagement process with ample opportunity for input. So I will just close by saying that City Club's research process has certainly led us to a specific set of recommendations for how to reform governance to improve equity and effectiveness, which really go hand in hand. Others, including the League of Women Voters, have dug into the issue and come to their own conclusions and recommendations. So the thing I most want to emphasize today is that the overwhelming consensus we've heard in conversation after conversation for the last 3.5 years is that the best way to collectively find a new way forward is through an accessible, transparent charter review process with deep and frequent opportunities for engagement. This is really going to be our best chance to ensure that any reform process is one that is thoughtful, cohesive, and well supported. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Colin. Joanne, Commissioner Hardesty has a question for you. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that presentation. Did I remember that City Club was was trying to put something on the ballot this year to change the form of government?
We, in early 2020, were looking at the different ways to move forward the research, and which included consideration of a ballot measure and the charter review process. And as we had conversations in communities and with partners, the conclusion we came to was that charter review process is absolutely the right way to advance any kind of reform of this scale.
I agree. Thanks. I was wondering where that process was. Thank you. Great presentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you. And I'm glad to hear that the process set by the charter is something that the City Club is supporting. I'm wondering if you are going to revisit the issues now that we have the open and accountable election system, and we have seen much greater participation by people from East Portland, people from people of color. Is City Club going to examine that?
That's a great question. We're likely not going to redo the recommendations of the report because, as I said, that was a 2.5-year process and there's not quite the timeline for that. But we are recognizing that the specific recommendations are likely less central than the conclusions and findings about equity and access and sort of those core principles that should guide any governance system. And those continue to be true even as facts on the ground change in relation to our new process.
Thank you. And then just one final question. Did you look at different forms of new government? For instance, in many cities in Oregon, individual council members are not allowed to respond to constituents. They have to send everything to the city manager. Did you make recommendations on what kind of change should be happening?
We did. The committee looked at a number of forms, both here in Oregon and nationally, primarily focusing on cities sort of comparable in size and scope to the city of Portland. The recommendation does call for a city manager, but part of that recommendation is certainly not cutting off access to city councilors. And in fact, a key component of the recommendation, as our committee saw it, was to increase constituent services and direct connection to communities by city councilors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. First of all, Colin, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank you for the leadership of the City Club in looking at various aspects of the form of governance. And I've never been particularly shy about what I see as being some of the shortcomings of the commission form of government. And it goes beyond representation. I think representation is critically important, but for me, it's also been about accountability. And it's also been about just the function of government. And so I think these are all legitimate discussions and debates for the community to have. Ultimately, it's the community's decision. It's their government, and they get to decide what they want or what they don't want. And then my personal pet peeve, as everybody knows, is I just think it's nuts to have the mayor also be the police commissioner for a lot of reasons that I won't bore anybody with right now. But the bigger question is, now that you have done your multi-year research project, you've already engaged the community. How do you see, since you have come to a recommendation, the City Club has now supported a very specific response to the question of how do we organize our government, but the Charter Review Commission really has the opportunity to look at this more holistically and re-ask the question. And so how do you see your work plugging into what will effectively be a reset opportunity for the Charter Review Commission? How do you see your completed work fitting in with the beginning of their work? How do you see that interface happening?
Yeah, I imagine it to be one of many sources of information for the Charter Review Commission. It is absolutely our expectation that the Commission will re-ask these questions, and they should. City Club is engaged in a pretty broad-based process, but both the last research committee and the research committee for the unpublished voting methods research really emphasized that this community engagement process needs to go beyond City Club. Which is a lot of our appreciation for Charter Review as the most central and accessible process. So I think we would envision City Club's research joining in with the League of Women Voters research and research out of communities of color and other organizations who are also building up a body of knowledge. Because as I said, with literature review, with witnesses, it may give the Charter Review Commission a head start and one particular lens on how to move forward. Certainly, we think our recommendations are good, but we also appreciate the Charter Review Commission is going to learn new things and is going to, frankly, what it sounds like, and which is great, have more staff support than we're able to provide our research committees. So that's ideal to continue that research work and engagement work.
Yeah, and I want to just concur. I think that's one of the great benefits is the Charter Review Commission, should they choose to take up the issue of the form of government, which I personally believe will be front and center, but again, it's an independent commission. They will have the benefit of the research you've already done and probably access to some experts that you've already accessed. That's the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side of the ledger, individuals who are on that Charter Review Commission might feel some pressure given that the League of Women Voters and the City Club are both venerable and reasonably influential organizations in this community. So that there will be a little bit of a balancing act between both information gathering and support on one hand and advocacy potentially on the other. And I think as long as everybody comes in just acknowledging that those are potential issues, I think it's net strongly positive. Commissioner Hardesty, you have your hand raised.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. Yes, I just want to support what you just said. I think it's going to be important that the Charter Review Commission is able to obtain information from a whole host of sources and not assume that one source is an expert on any issue that they are thinking about. As I thought about something that Commissioner Fritz said earlier, I think the universe has changed a lot since City Club did its report. We now have finance limits at the City of Portland. We now have a public finance system that makes elections more accessible. And so it is my hope that that the global reach of the Charter Review Commission will allow them to tap into a whole lot of different information sources that paints the whole picture for them about what governance looks like. So, and I personally don't have any vested interest in government and our governance one way or another. Whatever the people decide will be fine. I just want to make sure that they're also not unduly influenced by folks that appear to have a big stick and big power. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Are there any other questions for Colin?
All right. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And for our last speaker, we'll hear from Andrea Valderrama from the Coalition of Communities of Color, and she'll help us focus on what this process means for the community.
Welcome, Andrea.
Mayor Wheeler and commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to join you for this work session today. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sure we can. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Like Shoshana said, my name is Andrea Valderrama. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I serve as the Advocacy Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color. The CCC, for a little bit of background, is an alliance of culturally specific community-based organizations with representation from immigrant and refugee, African American, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latinx, Native American, and Slavic communities. And our mission is to support a collective racial justice effort to improve outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color through policy analysis and advocacy, environmental justice, culturally appropriate data and research, and leadership development and training. We were asked to join you in this work session today to share a little bit more about some of the community conversations that have been happening, the coalition building around this idea of a city hall for all, of really reaching out and hearing from you all and partnering on some of these real institutional inequities that our communities have been experiencing in the state since it started. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the current structure of the commission form of government. At the Coalition of Communities of Color, we envision through our efforts that Portland's BIPOC communities will one day obtain self-determination, wellness, justice, and prosperity. And we envision this future because currently our communities are disproportionately impacted by many inequities, many of which can be traced back to a singular institution, this commission form of government. And we know that because in 1913, when the commission form of government was first established, the Oregon Constitution banned any, quote, free mulatto not residing in the state at that time, also African Americans, but I'm not going to use the term that they use there, from living, holding real estate, and making any contracts within the state. We also know that in 1867, just 46 years prior, PPS institutionalized segregation. We also know that in 1902, the only officially recorded lynching in Oregon occurred. And in 1919, just 6 years after the commission form of government was established, redlining became a law. And in 1921, 8 years after the KKK established an Oregon chapter. We also wanted to lift up and appreciate the mayor's remarks at the beginning of this work session that the colonial mentality, settler colonialism, was very much on the minds of those who established this commission, and that Indigenous sovereignty was neither envisioned nor desired. Portland's commission form of government was established with the intention of preserving white supremacy and furthering the disenfranchisement of BIPOC communities. And I wanted to acknowledge Walida Imarisha, and specifically her A Hidden History blog and timeline, which included some of these details here. And then if you can move forward on the next slide, please. There's just a little bit more around on, at the time of this commission form of government being formed, some of the individuals here in this picture include the Portland Police Chief, a district attorney, a U.S. attorney, Multnomah County Sheriff, and the Portland Mayor at that time. And I share this, next slide, please, because again, this is all the experiences and the reality of the leadership in Portland city government, and also the reality and culture that the city of Portland was very much in. So we also know that the commission form has institutionalized several inequities, and the disenfranchisement of BIPOC communities has occurred at every level of Portland city government, from leadership all the way down. We also know that only 3 people of color have served on council thus far. We had Charles Jordan, joined by appointment in 1974, Dick Bogle in 1992 through 1992, and Commissioner Joanne Hardesty was elected in 2018. And I also want to acknowledge Carmen Rubio will be the first Latinx to serve beginning next year in 2021. So that's one form of the institutionalized inequities. But in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the community at large, I also want to lift up that there was significant disenfranchisement of BIPOC communities who live in Outer East Portland and even Southwest Portland, in areas of the city that weren't annexed until later, and a lack of meaningful progress on critical issues occurred until just recently when we look at transportation safety, public and community safety, civic engagement. I myself live in Outer East Portland and can absolutely be a witness in the unstable Wi-Fi that we still currently have out here, and other necessary utilities and necessary resources. And so I wanted to lift this up as we look at the challenges really facing all of our leaders in Portland City Hall when we are trying to reform bureaus, trying to improve them like PPB, parks, and civic life, and that BIPOC communities have continually been on the forefront, really advocating for these reforms, advocating for a more equitable, livable experience in Portland. And quite frankly, it's been pretty overwhelming. Next slide, please. So I say all of that because we're really excited to be leading this new coalition around really implementing and being a part of transformational change to address these inequities, these systemic and institutional inequities. The City Hall for All Coalition is charged with just that. We're charged with really looking at continuing to lead with BIPOC voices, those most directly impacted, to set this up for success. We want liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, leading with Black, Indigenous people of color. And we know that the only way that we can do that is to build out the people power necessary to address these issues of and by our own communities. And we know that we have this opportunity to address institutionalized racism and white supremacy and make historic changes to City Hall and to our city. And we really hope that you as City Council and as the appointees get set into the Charter Review Commission, that you all will join us in really addressing these inequities that we've been experiencing for some time. Our coalition will be predominantly focusing on recruitment and outreach of Charter Review Commissioners. And in addition to policy and community organizing, we will share more details with you all and your offices soon so that you have what you need from the coalition. And we also will continue to advocate for meaningful community engagement throughout the process. I deeply appreciated the comments from Anita Yap and Shelley Romero, who really outlined the significant workloads that they as individual community members had to undertake as commissioners. And so we're really urging you all to think through the best practices for community engagement and to follow those inclusive of meals, food, stipend, childcare, et cetera, to make sure that all voices have an equitable opportunity at participating in the commission. Next slide, please.
While you're changing slides, Andrea, Commissioner Hardesty, do you have a question, or is that just residual from before?
Sorry, Mayor, it's just residual.
No worries. Thank you. Sorry, Andrea.
No worries. Go ahead. And this is just the last slide here that we are asking for you as commissioners to really appoint commissioners who adhere to anti-racism and equitable representation as core values, that you commit to making City Hall a place for all Portlanders, a place where in the past that has not been the case, and to really think through how you have this historic opportunity in front of you to make some real significant changes. We're also hoping that you can ensure that this process addresses the issues that most directly impact BIPOC communities and communities most directly impacted. I think there was a lot of great conversation earlier about, what those issues are. I don't necessarily think that, it's appropriate to talk about all of them at this moment. I think in general, the fact that you are centering those issues and really ensuring that the Charter Review Commission has the opportunity to really have those front and center is ultimately really key and something that we're really excited about. And then the last issue that I'll mention again is meaningfully engaging with communities and meaningfully engage with the community and resource and put funding behind best practices for engagement is going to be really important, and something that we are hopeful you all can prioritize so that, again, all of our voices can be lifted up. So that's the end of the slides that I had here. Again, really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about where the community is at on this, and looking forward to partnering with you all on this really exciting opportunity moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Drea. We appreciate it very much. Thank you for spending some time with us this morning. Colleagues, any questions? Thank you.
So if there are any additional questions from the council, we'd be happy to have conversation now, but I really would like to thank you for your time and attention today, and for the opportunity for our first of many discussions about the Charter Commission. Your feedback today was very useful, and we'll be sure to incorporate it into our work forward. Of course, we're going to strive to meet your expectations, and of course the very high expectations that the community has for us to do this right. So with that, that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you. Commissioner Fritz has a question.
Thank you. I thought we were going to be discussing more about how are we going to make our selections to ensure that the values that have been expressed by community members are evidenced in the commission. And let me just give a bit more background to the 2011 Charter Commission. I believe from memory that commission was called for in the 2007 charter changes, which passed, and they were thinking that the form of government was going to change in 2007, so that a charter commission fairly shortly thereafter might be needed to do some revisions if it wasn't working out quite as well. So that was why we put it together as an interim commission. And the way we selected folks then, we were very concerned about making sure that it was representative of the community, because, again, that was in the charter changes that were adopted in 2007. And so what we did was we asked all of our boards and commissions, would they please give us their information to the commission, boards and commission members, to give us information about where they lived, their demographics, etc. And then the council chose from that matrix, and I actually waited and made my choices at the end to see which communities were not represented in the choices that everybody else had made. So we had a different process to put folks on the Clean Energy Commission, and that was more staff oriented. This is absolutely in the charter that this is the council, each council member gets to choose for. So I'm interested in either Shoshana or my colleagues having some discussion on how are we going to do that.
Maybe we can ask Keelan to put slide, I think 8 back up. And absolutely, thank you so much for the question, Commissioner Fritz. We've heard from all of your chiefs of staff that you wanted to take lessons learned from good processes that went well, like the PSEF selection. And so we're trying to incorporate that, some of those lessons learned on how to select a good process. I think it's number 8. Yeah, oh, too far. One more. Thank you. That's it. So what we've done with this process, which is different than the previous process, was we are using a common application. So rather than all of the friends of Commissioner Oppenheim coming to me and saying, I'd like to be on the Charter Commission, we're having it a much more generalized application, so that everybody has a fair shot. So it's not that it's not. So it's much more open to the public. And so from that application, we'll have a first screen of just making sure that people are committed to the goals of engagement, transparency, and accountability that you've heard outlined today. And then from that, there will be a second screen, which all of the city council participates in, and that there's really looking for a shared effort, applying a unified equity lens, consistent criteria to have a cohesive commission. We think that this will be one of those ways that we can really ensure that we have greater representation from the BIPOC community, communities of color, of course, people, making sure that we have representation from people who come to the conversation with a knowledge about access and interest to the people with disabilities community, as well as the LGBTQ community, and making sure that they have representation. We're proposing a much more collaborative effort that mirrors some of the wins from the PSEF application, so that you really know that you're developing a cohesive commission that meets your expectations.
So presumably we each get input into what the application looks like? I was hoping that that you already had that input. I was shared with execs and screened through them about a month ago. So I apologize if Commissioner Hadish is shaking your head, and I didn't have it either, which is if you could resend it, that would be good.
Sure, I'm happy to. Commissioner Hardesty, you suggested some revisions that went through your chief of staff, and we incorporated into the application.
Oh, I remember us talking about it, but I don't think that I have something new from the conversation with my chief of staff. So good.
Yeah, so that was an opportunity where we went to execs to solicit input, and then we shared the questions, and the questions came back to us, and I only received comments from Commissioner Hardesty.
I do have.
If I could just comment on that. A month ago, we were in the middle of the budget, and that was definitely what I was focused on. So I apologize for missing the request for the application, but I would like to comment on it now. If you could resend it to me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And when did we say this process would start?
We plan to launch the application process today. We were planning on closing it August 15th, holding it open for 45 days. That would then allow for a review process in October after the new commissioner joins us for position 2, and then allowing us to appoint early in the fall.
So it sounds like.
Okay, wait a minute though.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner Fritz.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Hardesty. Let's. I hope this is a conversation. Of course, that's very difficult over Zoom. That doesn't seem fair to the new commissioner, that whoever that person is, although you said it shouldn't be friends of Commissioner Fritz, friends of Commissioner Hardesty, there certainly will be people that we know of who we will encourage to apply. And so having the applications close when, what's the date of the August special election?
It's on the 11th, and I just want you to know that we've invited both candidates for that position to participate, to watch today's council session, and we'll be in contact with both of their offices, keeping them apprised as to the progress that we're making and update them on the process. So if there are candidates that they would like to be included in the application process, we are hoping that they are aware, since we're reaching out to them and engaging with them to encourage those people to apply through the process.
And then how do you assure that there's appropriate diversity at the end of the process? Because, each one member of the council is entirely committed to the goals and values that we've heard about. And we've been living it for the time that each one of us has been on the council. So how then do you make sure that we don't have, we could have 20 Indigenous people or 20 this, that, or the other. How do you see that happening, Shoshana?
I think they're very similar to the PSEF process, where there was a collaborative screening and conversation. What I understand in the past is that there wasn't a really collaborative effort. I don't know if we've ironed out all the nuts and bolts of that one city approach, but it's our effort to make sure that your expectations for having a diverse and representative commission is achieved, but also so that it is a collaborative process, where you're able to ensure that we have that representative commission at the end of the day.
It seems like we're starting this process really early, and because I understand that we are supposed to have them appointed by, is it December of this year or November of this year? So why especially when they're going to do nothing until January of next year, why are we starting the process so early and ending it so early?
Sure. Keelan, do you mind going back to the previous slide? So again, as I mentioned, that this timeline really anticipates that there is an interest in referring, or we need to be available to refer qualified recommendations to the ballot. It was the collective thinking when we went to execs that the 22 ballot was the one that would derive the most interest. If we're going to have recommendations.
I would disagree with that premise. I would think that any ballot that would have charter changes on it would have some interest. I would not be assuming that the committee is working towards a 2022 ballot. I think that's a false assumption to start with. But it doesn't answer my question about why we're appointing people in August.
Just to clarify, that was our best thinking, because we know that turnout is higher when there is
That's a policy person's position, right? A policy person is thinking about when's the best turnout. Community members don't care. Community members, if they agree on something, they're going to send it to the next ballot, and they don't really care whether it's a May ballot or a November ballot. I think that we're putting way too many political assumptions on top of this work, and that is not the role of us as staffing the committee or those of us that are appointing it. They will work at the pace that they set for themselves, and it's
Absolutely.
not up to us to determine whether or not they're shooting for that ballot. But August seems
Agreed.
for the appointments if they start work in January. Were you anticipating them starting before January?
Absolutely. So they would start as soon as they were there. We actually have a different boards and commission process now in place than we did in 2010. In 2010, we didn't really have the boards and commissions program as built out as it is now. Now there's required trainings for everyone that serves on a board and commission. So that takes time. We want to make sure we're currently working on a training with Dr. Smith that would not only include equity, but would actually also be grounding the commission in the impacts of white supremacy. So we think that there is some work that the commission needs to do in order to understand their role as public officials, what the roles of the public meeting laws, all of that, and then to build their work plan. So we're just trying to give them as much time as possible. Absolutely, they do not need to be appointed until December 15th. But what we understood from our conversations with your chiefs of staff was that there was interest and understanding that if we gave them as much time as possible, they may not go to the 22 ballot. They may go to a ballot in 23 or in 24. They may go to a special election. It may as determined. But if we start the work earlier and give them as much time as possible, then they have the greatest amount of flexibility. If they are ready with recommendations in 22, then they have the opportunity to do that. I think that, I don't have a lot of experience in this area, but I do know that it is turnout is a consideration. There's definitely more turnout in November than there is in the May primaries. And so these are things that we will want them. They get to determine their own work plan. This is just a suggestion of a schedule. When they come together as a group and determine we want to work on these 4 issues, we actually want to look on 7 issues, they'll determine what their work plan is. But if we don't give them enough time to meet the minimum amount of time for conversations for the 22 ballot, then that was our concern.
Commissioner Fritz.
So I think I agree with Commissioner Hardesty that the work of the commission should determine when it goes to the ballot. I appreciate having a goal, and 9 months to do all the work is going to be necessary. I mean, there's issues other than the form of government that really need to be addressed. So, these people are not going to be working full time, being paid full time. And so I think it's unrealistic to expect more than a couple of meetings a month. And so I just would keep that in mind. And I know that you therefore want to get started as soon as possible, Shoshana and your team, given that I haven't seen the application and that Commissioner Hardesty would like to review it again. Commissioner Udaley's out today, and I don't know if she's seen it. We haven't had any discussion with her about it. I request that we don't put the application out until, at least the end of the week. That would be very helpful.
Thank you for that.
And again, I wonder if it's a good time to be recruiting in the summertime. I know this is a unique summertime opportunity because we're still in the midst of COVID-19. But my assumption was that we were going to start recruiting in the fall, and we would have a couple of months in the fall to actually make sure that we were doing the level of outreach that we think is necessary to get the right people to even be willing to put an application in. So I am very concerned about this timeline that actually shortens our ability to go out and engage with our community around the importance of this Charter Review Commission. And I do think that there are a lot of assumptions made about what will motivate Charter Review Commission members to support one thing or another. And I think we have to take all those assumptions out of this work and just know that we are putting the system in place. And once we put the system in place, the system will decide where it's headed.
Yeah, point well taken. So I'll regroup with execs after this conversation. We can refine our thinking on the schedule. And absolutely, I apologize. I thought that this had been vetted with your offices.
No, I understand when you talk to chief of staffs because they're like, they're thinking political stuff. But when you're talking to just regular people and you're inviting them to participate in your governance, you can't make assumptions about what's going to motivate them to move on whatever issues, right? And I agree that good training at the front end is going to be vital. I just don't know if I'm not sure where the training was supposed to take place in this timeline that's been presented. Because the reality is, if we appoint them by the end of the year, it won't be until January when you can actually start doing the training and getting them situated for service on this commission. So, how long do you think it's going to take to do the training? Because again, that would determine when would be the best time for the appointment.
Right, exactly. And I think that we thought that there would be at least, a few months of them getting organized themselves, as well as for them to meet all the requirements of the various trainings that Civic Life has in place for them. So that's an additional reason why we backed up the schedule to give them additional time in this calendar year. The requirement is that they're appointed by December 15th. So since it is this existing city council, plus the addition of whoever has seat 2, that will make the appointment. It was our understanding that there was agreement that any time in the fall would be appropriate. And your point's well taken, Commissioner Hardesty. Under normal circumstances, I would never recruit in the summer when we expect people to be out of town. But with the stay-at-home restrictions and the additional limitations on travel, we were thinking that the uniqueness of summer 2020 made it a little bit more appropriate to recruit during this time. Additionally, we have been working with community leaders to brief them and to engage with them so that folks expect that this application is coming, and working very much with the Coalition of Communities of Color, their members, and other organizations to make sure that we're able to amplify the application and ensure that you have a strong pool of applicants. But all of your concerns are well heard, and I will regroup with execs and see what modifications that you'd like to see.
I do think that we're not ready to send this out today. And so that's my humble opinion, because I still don't feel comfortable with kind of the timeline as it's been laid out. I personally would like to have more information about the type of training that will be just how we onboard people so that we have an opportunity to review that. I am very concerned that it feels like even though the council are going to be appointing people, that we don't have a role in this process as it's been presented today. It feels like the process is happening without us, and that doesn't feel good when I'm responsible for ensuring that I have 4 good people to serve on this commission. So,
absolutely, and I apologize. There was no intention to not include you in the process, and I apologize if I assumed that you were getting regular briefings when you were not.
Well, I mean, I knew that you were developing the application. I had no idea about some of the specifics that you've mentioned today. And, you might be able to convince me that this is the right move to make at this time. But when I hear about some of the assumptions that this timeline was put together based on, that causes me concern, because we should never be concerned about what ballot anything's going to be on that comes out of the Charter Review Commission. That shouldn't even be part of our consideration. So just knowing what the premises that some of this information is built on really concerns me. I plan to be very involved. I plan to be actively recruiting people to participate on this Charter Review Commission, because I know it's vital for the future that we're going to have in the city of Portland. And so I in no way want to be left out of this process and just be given a list of names to choose between as my appointees. That will not work for me. And I just want to say I appreciate your enthusiasm, and I'm excited about this Charter Review Commission as well. And I see the enthusiasm, and I know we're going to have great staff for this commission. But we have to remember that the staff has a role, the commission has a role, and the city council has a role. And those roles are very distinct in this process.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Hardesty, and I'm mindful that often we council members like the staff to do all of the work for us and to give us a narrower set of choices to make. In this particular instance, I would like to see all of the applications. That certainly my staff and I would be wanting to go through them, in addition to getting recommendations from Shoshana and your team. So I'd like to see, who Commissioner Hardesty recruits. I'm sure she's going to have a lot of folks applying, that I will be very interested to read their application, and that's why I want the application, to be sure to ask the questions that I would want to ask my my appointees. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Good discussion, colleagues. Any other questions, comments? Very good. It sounds like
I do just have one more question. Normally, when you recruit for people, you do tell them the meetings might be on this date, or this is about the time commitment. Is that decided at this point? How often we're going to be asking them to meet?
Sure, we can send you the draft recruitment that we were hoping to use to announce the application. We've estimated that we could expect it to be between 5 and maybe 12 hours a month, just based on what a typical board service is, and maybe an additional, there may be at least 1 3-hour meeting a week, a month, and then outside reading. We're trying to include both outside reading and consultation with community as hours that they should expect to serve. But again, they get to set their own work plan, and if they choose to extend this over 18, 24, however many months, then that will also dictate the number of hours that they should expect.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardis, do you remember how much time you invested when you were on the 2011 commission?
I came in as a replacement, and I remember us meeting definitely weekly, and at least 2-hour meetings weekly.
Thanks.
And I wanted to make sure that we are prepared to have materials translated, and so that it is accessible for all members of the Charter Review Commission, as well as the public who will be viewing the proceedings or participating in the proceedings. Yes?
Absolutely. And the current application has been prepared for translation. Just I don't think I mentioned that we used the base application for the Office of Civic Life that they use for their recruitment of boards and commissions as the template, and then we added additional questions that we thought were relevant to the Charter Review Commission. So it wasn't that we developed an application specifically for this. We modified the application process that the Boards and Commission program uses, and then that was prepared for translation.
And one last question I had. I thought the appointment was a 2-year appointment. Why are we trying to shorten the timeline that this commission has to do its work?
It's absolutely a 2-year appointment. And this is how it could go if they wanted to be ready for the 22 ballot. If that's not a consideration, we have a lot more room and flexibility in the schedule. But because I understood that was an interest, was making sure that they had.
I'm not sure whose interest that was. I don't know what the magicness of the 2022 ballot is. I don't know whose interest that represents, but I'm just thinking if we appoint them for 2 years, their work will
absolutely
go over that period of time, right?
Sure, and they can also be appointed for a second 2-year term, so that they have up to 4 years to complete their work.
Well, let's hope it doesn't take that long, but.
All right, colleagues, good conversation. We are now over time, so I think we will bring it to a close. There's plenty to discuss here amongst ourselves, amongst staff. I want to thank everybody who presented today. This was a fantastic presentation. We heard important perspectives. And it gives us a lot to think about. Obviously, because this is a work session, we can't make decisions here, but I think you all did a good job of laying the foundation. So thank you, and we are adjourned.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.